is we have a short board meeting, conduct business of the society. And so just a quick update, we are solvent. You should be glad to hear that. So we do have a little over $4,000 in our account. Mainly our income is through membership dues. So thank you to everybody who's up to date on their dues, as well as donations. Our main expense is always our newsletter, as well as some insurance and some subscriptions. And we have some memberships in some societies as well. So those are our main expenses that we have as a society. Our membership hasn't changed substantially. We're close to 200 members, and some of those are other societies being members of us, just as we are members of other societies, and so that's great. Most recently, our library up at, as most people may know, are the society's collection. Our library is held at the Westminster Library, the main branch, where we also do research Thursdays from 1 until 4. Those have been active. People have been coming in, figuring out how they're related to each other as well as to our researchers. So there's a lot of work happening on our research Thursdays. And so that continues to be a good way for us to reach out to the community as well as to forward our mission as promoting the hobby of genealogy in Carroll County. Our programs are set up for the next 5 months, which is a testimony to our Vice President, Heather Owings, who has also been sitting in as our program chair. And I've told her that she's been doing the job so well, I may not let her leave it. So that's where we are right now. So coming up in December, we're not going to have a formal society meeting. We're working on having a society luncheon, one of the first 3 Saturdays. So that's in works. So more to come on a society luncheon for the holiday season. In January and February, we're going to go to Zoom. So we're going online. We're going to be using the library's Zoom account. In January, we're going to do something a little bit new. Rather than having an outside speaker, we're going to share as a society your favorite genealogy tips and tricks, something that you have found that is useful that maybe not everybody knows about. So that'll be in January, and then in February, you'll get to hear from me. I'll talk about African-American research in Carroll County focused on Ellsworth Cemetery, which I've been helping to restore and researching the lives of the people buried in that historic African-American cemetery that's just outside of Westminster. And then March, we're having somebody from the Enoch Pratt Library come and talk about how to use technology to share the information that you have on your family with other family members. In April, we'll have somebody from the McDaniel Archives come and talk about how to preserve Bibles and the importance of family Bibles in genealogy. And that's going to tie into our Bible scanning day, which will be a Saturday in April. Expect to see more on that. We're going to be looking for society members to participate in the planning for that Bible scanning day that's going to be open to the public, as well as to volunteer on that day. And then finally in May, the folks from the Enoch Pratt Library will come back specifically talking about how to organize your research using Google Drive. And so that's our upcoming programs. We'll send this out. You don't have to be writing furiously. It'll be the 3rd Monday of every month. We're going to keep that schedule going. So any questions on the business of the society? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about what you said. So these events that you're talking about are open to anyone or certain members?
Mm-hmm. All of our programming is open to the general public. Yeah, absolutely. The board meetings, we do ask that it be members only. If you want to come and sit on the board meeting, you're more than welcome to. But we do that's for members. If the public would be interested. So, okay. Anything else? Okay, so thank you again for coming tonight. I'm super excited to have Bob Belkey here. I met Bob online. I was doing the research at Ellsworth Cemetery and had posted about securing a headstone for one of the Civil War veterans who's buried there. And Bob reached out to me, he said, hey, I know a little bit about these pension records, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to pull a pension record for you. So Bob owns Gopher Records, that is his business. It's a bargain, I will tell you. But what I asked Bob, I said, thanks for the offer, but I'd really love for you to tell me how to do it, right? I'd love to be able to self-service. So, and he has been incredibly generous with his time and his wisdom and his knowledge about military pension records that are available downtown at the National Archives, the one, Archives 1, it's often called, the one on Pennsylvania Avenue. So Bob's been living in Maryland, native of Maryland, I believe, yes?
Well, born in Virginia, but lived in Maryland most of my life.
So we'll adopt you as a Maryland son, and has generously agreed to come and speak with us tonight about military pension records. So over to you, Bob. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thanks again for coming to listen to me. I imagine, based on your background and the fact that you're a member of the society, you have some understanding at least of the value of military pension records, if not specifically, at least in general. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time convincing you that it's worth the effort. And I'll give one example, but I will point out that, is this getting me, Heather?
Yeah.
I will point out that military pension records are probably the best contemporary firsthand records of soldiers, better even than compiled military service records, because compiled military service records, or CMSRs as they're called, are not contemporary. They were compiled some 20 years after the war, in the case of the Civil War. And they were written by somebody else, an adjutant, or transcribed from other records. So military pension records will very often have documents written by the veteran in their hand, in their signature, and their own testimony of what their service was like and what their disabilities are and so on. So it really is one of the very best sources of genealogical demographic information that you can get. Let's see if this will work here. There we go. So just some of the information you can find in a military pension records. Just about everything about the veteran: his birth, death, marriage, burial, his widows, may have more than one, her or their birth and death dates, her previous or subsequent marriages, their financial worth, land ownership, neighbors, physical description, everything you could want to know about his medical background, more than you'll ever want to know. And even including primary records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates. And as I say, his signatures, and even some photographs. You'll see some photographs as we go through today. All of the photographs you'll see in this presentation were found in pension records. Although, realistically, don't hold your breath for that. It's very rare to find a photograph in a pension record. Pension record is typically about 100 pages, but it can go from 3 or 4 pages if it's an application that was rejected or not followed up to more than 400 pages. This one's about 250 pages, I would guess, chock full of documents. This is an example of one I just want to go over here quickly. This is a mother's declaration for pension. As we'll talk about a little later, a mother could apply for her son's military pension if he is dead, and she can prove that she was dependent on his income. This document says that, the date is August 8th, 65. Mary Murphy, resident of New York, is 44 years old. So there we've got the mother's birth year, plus or minus. And it says that she was the widow of Patrick Murphy, who's the soldier's father. Matthew Murphy is the soldier who was a colonel in the 69th New York, died at City Point Hospital in Virginia on the 16th of April 65 of wounds received in action. So that's an awful lot of information for one document, but that's not all it has here. It goes on to say that Matthew, the soldier, left no widow or children under the age of 16, and that Mary, the mother, was married to Patrick, the father, in Killarney, Ireland, Great Britain, February 1838, by Reverend Father Flynn, and that the father, Patrick, died on the 1st of August, 1865. So most genealogists I know would give their left arm for a document like this. And honestly, this type with this much information in a single document is pretty rare, but a pension file, you remember, has dozens or hundreds of documents in it. So it's not uncommon to find an awful lot of this information spread out across these multiple documents, including, as I said, primary records, original copies of birth and death certificates in particular. The US government has given pensions to its veterans in all wars, starting with the Revolutionary War, but every other war I'm going to talk mostly about 18th and 19th century wars. Most of the soldiers in these wars were volunteers. There was what was called a regular army, which are the professional soldiers, the soldiers, for instance, that would go to West Point and would be in the army even when the country was not at war. And those soldiers got pensions as well, of course. And pretty much everything I talk about with respect to volunteers also applies to those professional soldiers. And once a soldier was eligible for a pension, he received it for the rest of his life, or his dependents likewise, as long as that person, the applicant, remained eligible. And we'll talk about what that means. I'm going to talk mostly about the Civil War because that is by far the most common interest. It's by far the most common records being pulled at the National Archives. We'll start with Confederate records though, because they aren't in Washington, D.C. The Confederate records are maintained by the states, the individual southern states, not where the soldier served, but where he lived after the war. So if he served for Virginia and then moved to Tennessee, Tennessee would have issued him a pension, at least in theory. All the southern states had this agreement that they would serve their residents regardless of where the soldier served. Of course, if the soldier moved into a northern state, he became ineligible for a pension. The federal government wasn't going to pay him for a pension for fighting for the Confederacy. Pensions were initially for disabilities only. They were not for service. He didn't just get a pension because he served. He had to demonstrate that he was disabled in order to qualify. That changed, as we'll see, in the Northern Army at least. Veterans, volunteers, and the regular Army soldiers. There was a regular Army in the Confederacy. It was formed in 1861. Those soldiers reported directly to the Confederate government. And the southern states would likewise give pensions to veterans of the regular Army, Confederate regular Army. Widows, if they qualified, would have to demonstrate that they were indigent. They couldn't live without it, with the support from their state or government. The thing about Confederate pension records, though, is every state was different. Every southern state had different rules about when a soldier was eligible and when or if the widows were eligible. Some states never gave pensions, but most of them didn't give pensions until 1880s, mid-1880s, more than 20 years after the war. Remember that southern states were very poor after the war. They didn't have a lot of money to be offering their veterans. The southern states, the border states, were special cases. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia. West Virginia, for instance, wasn't formed until 1863 in the middle of the war, but it was Virginia prior to that, and soldiers that lived in what is now West Virginia and fought for a Virginia regiment were not going to be served by the West Virginia government, federal state, but they were, in some cases anyway, offered pensions by Virginia, even though they lived after the war in West Virginia. The rules for Confederate pensions, as I say, varied by state, but they tended to be more strict because, again, the Confederate Army or the southern states serving Confederate veterans didn't have as much money. And the pensions for those Confederate veterans tended to be very short, or maybe 3-4 pages if you're lucky, compared to the Union Army pensions, which were issued by the federal government to all veterans, regardless of where they lived, all Union veterans, even if they lived in the South or anywhere else. That started in 1861. Actually, the law started in 1862, but it was retroactive, so that basically anybody who served as a federal soldier in the Civil War was eligible. Again, it was originally for disabilities, and the amount of disability determined the extent of the support, the amount of money they received, as well as other factors like what rank they were and how long they served. But that changed, as I said, and we'll talk about that. Volunteer and regular Army soldiers, again, were eligible. Widows and other dependents on the Union side, other dependents of the veteran. We saw an example of the mother, and we'll talk more about that. A pension, federal pension, I think I mentioned, if it's approved, it's typically about 100 pages, so there's lots of information, lots of different documents. Who could apply? Well, initially it was the invalid. That's not invalid, that's the invalid, the soldier who was disabled. And so pension documents usually refer to him as the invalid. But later, the documents would sometimes refer to him as the soldier or the survivor or the veteran. It all means the same thing. Invalid is the veteran himself. And then upon his death, the widow could apply under some circumstances. Minor children, there's a special case for what's called a helpless child. We'll talk about dependent mother, fathers, and sisters could apply as well, as, again, the rules loosened over time and more people were eligible for those benefits. In general, a veteran was eligible if he served 90 days in federal service, not in a home guard or state militia, for instance, although some of those home guards and state militias then came under federal jurisdiction, and so they served for the federal government and would be eligible for a pension. If they served in the home guard or state militia, sometimes the states, northern states, would offer pensions to those soldiers, but the federal government wouldn't. He had to be honorably discharged, or of course, killed in service, in the case of his widow and dependents. And he had to demonstrate initially that he was unable to do manual labor. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So the widow could be eligible for a pension first if she proved her marriage to him, if she proved that he was eligible, and if she proved that he was dead. So all this proving going on is what those documents are all about. So that's why it's so valuable to us, because she couldn't just apply and get it. She had to demonstrate these connections and these types of records that we're always looking for. If the soldier received a pension, of course, she didn't have to demonstrate his service, and the pension office would have access to most of those records as well. But for instance, in marriage, sometimes she would produce a marriage certificate. If she couldn't, she'd produce a letter from the minister or from other people who attended the wedding. In the case of his death, if the military didn't have a record of his death, again, there would be testimony on there, sometimes from other soldiers that he served with, and that sort of thing. Children, too, had to prove that they were related to the veteran. Now, that very often just came in the form of testimony from the mother, but usually there was also testimony from other witnesses that I attended the birth of this child. And then other applicants, like mothers, fathers, sisters, as I said, they were eligible if they proved their relationship and the fact that they were dependent on the income. So there are often letters, wartime letters written by the soldier saying, here's my pay for this month. And that would demonstrate their reliance on his revenue, on his income for their support. 3 important dates to remember when you're dealing with eligibility. First is 1861, of course, the beginning of the war, when any veteran would qualify if he was wounded or contracted a disease. Now, you may know far more soldiers died of disease than of wounds in the Civil War. And the same is true about pensions. There are far more pensions issued to soldiers who got respiratory or digestive issues, that sort of thing, hearing problems. So that's where all these testimony from doctors come in. In 1890, the rules changed. The law changed to say that the soldier could get a pension if he was disabled, regardless of the source of that disability. So, for instance, I researched a soldier who was painting his house and fell off the scaffold in 1882 and applied for a pension and was turned down. But in 1890, he applied again and it was approved. So you'll see when you look at some of these index records, which we'll look at, you'll see that when a soldier applied in 60s, 70s, 80s, and it was approved, it's a good bet that they were wounded or contracted disease. Or at least they proved that to the satisfaction of the Pension Bureau. Millions and millions of new applicants applied in 1890 because of the passage of that new law. Keeping in mind that many of those soldiers of the Civil War were in the GAR, which was very influential, lobbying the government to expand benefits for veterans. And many of those veterans were in Congress themselves. So starting in 1890, the rules started to loosen up. As of 1907, any veteran who survived could get a pension regardless of whether he was disabled. Of course, by 1907, we're talking 40 years after the war, they could usually make some argument that they were disabled in some way. But they were eligible. And widows and dependents would only qualify if he had qualified. So if he fell off that scaffold and died in 1885, the widow could not apply. She could apply, but she wouldn't get it. She could apply again in 1890 and she would get it. This, by the way, is a full-size, life-size drawing or outline of a soldier I found in a pension record to demonstrate his disability, his amputation of his arm. When would the benefits end? Well, when the veteran died, of course, his benefits ended, but they could also end earlier than that if he overcame whatever his disability was. If he had claimed a respiratory or digestive issue, he'd have to submit to a doctor on a regular basis to be examined. And at some point, if the doctor said that he's no longer disabled, that he can do manual labor, then he would lose those benefits. More often, of course, the benefits or the disability would increase over time, and the benefits would increase over time as well. The widow would lose her benefits if she got remarried, although that changed later as well. It was after 1900, it was 1902, somewhere in there, if she had remarried and that her second husband died or they were divorced through no fault of her own, then she could apply again for her first husband's pension. And if she had both a husband and a child, or more than one son who died in the war, she could only get one pension. She couldn't accumulate them. Minor children means 16 years old. On their 16th birthday, they would be disqualified, except for what they call a helpless child. Again, a helpless child, I mentioned earlier, but I didn't explain it. It's somebody who had a mental or physical disability that made them permanently disabled, permanently unable to support themselves. They would get lifetime benefits and they would never age out of it. You might remember this lady, Helen Jackson, was the last Civil War widow. She married a soldier who they married in 1936. He was 93, she was 17. He died 3 years later. She never did apply for his pension because she didn't qualify. This is a pretty common myth about, especially around the Depression. A lot of people say that These young girls would marry old veterans who needed somebody to take care of them, and in exchange, they would get the veterans' benefits. Well, that very rarely happened because the government was onto this particular custom. They, as early as 1890, passed a law saying that widows could only be eligible if they married prior to that date. So by the early 1900s, they couldn't just marry, and if he died a year or two later, they couldn't qualify for his pension. She couldn't qualify. That did change in 1925, I think it was. They changed it to the rollover date was 1905. So it was, they could have been married later and she would qualify. But again, it was 10 or 15 years they had to be married before she would qualify for his pension. So these May, December romance things, the deal between a young girl and an old veteran was mostly a myth. It happened more often in the South, where the rules were a little less strict. And again, they varied from state to state. There was, of course, a lot of pension fraud as well. So some of these people did manage to get a pension, but technically were not eligible. You might also remember this lady, Irene Strickland, died the same year, 2020. She was the last pensioner, and she was one of these helpless children of was originally a Confederate veteran, but then he deserted and registered with a Union regiment, 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry. She was born in 1930, and she got pension benefits, all of like $75 a month until she died. Now, to understand pensions, you really need to understand the numbering systems that were used to manage them. If a veteran applied for a pension, that application would receive a number, an application number that would follow with the paperwork wherever it went. It's sometimes called the individual number or the original number. It means the same thing. It's the number that was applied at the time the documents were submitted. If it was approved, it received a certificate number. This is a completely different number system or different number series. And so you can tell in the indexes if they received an application but not a certificate, that they applied but it was not approved for one reason or another. If the widow then applied after his death, she would get another application number, and if it was approved, she'd get another certificate number. Likewise for minor children or other dependents. So a single pension file, these would all be bundled together, by the way, they're not separate folders. They'd all be put into the same file. A single packet of information might have 6 or more numbers associated with it, application numbers, certificate numbers for veterans and their dependents. There's also another completely different numbering system for what's called C or XC numbers, a number that has a C or an XC in front of it is a number that was issued by the Veterans Administration when they took over. Pension Bureau came under the auspices of the Veterans Administration in the 1930s. Any veterans or dependents who were surviving that long received a new number issued by the Veterans Administration, and that number overrode all the others. That's the number it was filed under. We'll see some examples. In order to get your hands on the pension itself, you need to go find that pension in an index, and there are multiple indexes to choose from. The first and maybe most commonly found is what's called the General Index. It's most common because it's free on Family Search. I don't need to explain to you about Family Search, right? Everybody understand? You can subscribe to it. There's no religious test, and it's free. You get access to all their records. Ancestry.com is a subscription service, of course, and you can get the General Index there as well. The Organizational Index is only available on Fold 3. While the General Index is alphabetical, all the soldiers are listed by their last name, the Organizational Index is listed by company and regiment, and within that, the soldiers by name. So if you know his company and regiment, you can find him in the Organizational Index, And right next to that will be all the other soldiers who served in the same company who also received pensions. It's handy to have two of them, in spite of the fact that they're available in different places, because sometimes one of those cards would be not legible or smudged, or numbers would be missing. And on my website, which is listed on the handout, we'll talk about some more. There are case studies showing where the general index had one set of numbers and the organizational index had a different set of numbers, or a subset of the ones that were listed on the other one. Fold3 and Ancestry, by the way, as we say, they're subscription services, but there are a lot of ways you can access them for free. I'm told that the library here has ancestry.com, so you can just sit down and use it there. Lots of libraries do, some have Fold3 as well. I don't know about the one in Westminster, anybody happen to know? You can also get access to Ancestry and Fold3 at any of the family history centers, the LDS Mormon Church centers. There's one up in Hempstead, yes, right. And then one down closer to me in Columbia, and then one in Frederick. Hempstead is the closest one to you. And then we're going to talk about pension payment cards, another form of index. You'll often, or not often, but sometimes you're convinced that a soldier received a pension, but you can't find him in any of those prior to pension index systems. You can find a record that he received payments. And that record will also have his pension numbers that you can submit to have the pension file pulled. The pension payment cards are available on Fold3 and on Family Search. The full links to those are on the handout, the top half of the handout. And then there's the fourth indexing system is the numerical index. So if you happen to know the number, because you've come across it somewhere, you can look it up by number and see whose pension that is, and we'll see an example of that too. So let's just go over them quickly here. This is the general index, an example of one. Marks Boyer is the soldier, and he was in Company B, 205th Pennsylvania Infantry. There are three types of, or classes of applicants that are listed here: the invalid, the widow, and a minor. There are variations on this card in the general index as years passed. They added other lines. Sometimes you'll see mother and father listed as separate lines, but there's a blank line there which would be filled out by hand if this card didn't have the line that they needed. Then for each of those applicants, you see they have an application number and a certificate number. Well, you can tell from this that the widow applied in 1901, but did not receive that pension. The one or more minor children, let's just go back here first. So he applied in 1885 and received his pension. The widow received it, applied for it in 1901, and the widow's name is listed at the top there on this general index. And then the minor child, or more than one minor child, you can't tell from this how many there were, applied later that same year and did receive the pension. And by the way, in the far right-hand column, you can see that the place they lived at the time they applied, which is also very handy sometimes. You find out that they moved out west somewhere and you didn't know where to find them. You often find it on this index card. The minor's name is not listed on the document. The name that's there, Mayon Widner, was the guardian. That's what that GDN means, guardian. So that's one example of the general index card. Here's another one that has that C number at the bottom. C usually means that the veteran survived until the 1930s or so. An XC number means that the widow is the one who's still drawing pension in the 1930s. Although that wasn't completely true, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, you can tell from whether it's a C or an XC number. C and XC pensions are not held, well, most of them are not in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives. Most of them are either in the National Archives facility in St. Louis or still held by the Veterans Administration. There have been several periods over the years in which the Veterans Administration sent bunches of pensions back to the National Archives when they were closed out. Unfortunately, they didn't send them to DC, they sent them to St. Louis, if nobody's ever sent them from there. So that's where they still reside. And as I say, the Veterans Administration still holds many of those pensions, and they're only accessible through a FOIA request. That's a pain in the backside. Here's an example of the organizational index, and it's largely, certainly in terms of the general detail, it's the same. This is the same soldier, Marks Boyer, company B205th PA. But this organizational index has some types of data that the general index does not, including his enlistment date and discharge date. At least it's got places for those. Not all cards have them filled out, but many of them do, and you won't find them on the general index, the free one on Family Search. This is only on Fold 3. The organizational index also very frequently has death date and place of the soldier at the bottom. This would be the death date and place of the veteran, not of any other applicant. So which do you use, the general index or the organizational index? Well, as you can tell, there's different data on different cards. So the best answer is both. If you have access to them, get both of them. But you should at least look at the Family Search one or Ancestry one, the general index, because that's the only one that has those C and XC numbers on it. And if you go to all the trouble of going to the National Archives or paying somebody to do it for you, and it turns out that pension has a C or XC number, it will be all for naught because it's not down there in DC. So you should always get the general index, get the organizational index if you can. This is a pension payment card, which we mentioned, and again, it's only available on Fold 3 and Family Search. And there are minor differences between those two as well. Not significant in terms of this discussion, but this is a record of the fact that he received money. This is actually a pension payment card for a minor. So it says Army minor. See up towards the top, it says this is the Army minor's pension payment. The veteran's still at the top, but there's the minor's name, the child's name, Loretta. This is on the pension payment card. So, well, I'll show you another example in a minute. But then there are two dates next to the child's name. The first is the commencement, and the second one is the ending. The commencement is the date that the child filed, or the guardian on her behalf. You might remember she applied in December of 1901. That number itself isn't all that significant. The second date, though, is the ending date, the last date in which this child would be eligible. So that's her 16th birthday. So subtract 16 from that and you get her birth date. Here's another example with 3 children and their birthdays, or their 16th birthdays, from which you can subtract. Now they're lined out here because, well, we don't know exactly why, but our theory is that as each child would age out, the name would be lined out by the pension office or the Veterans Administration. So luckily, they just put one line through so we can still read them, but that's what that means. Here's an example of a pension payment card with a married date on it. So there's all kinds of information you sometimes find on these cards. Here's one that has the death of, in this case, the widow. Annie Harrison is a different soldier. So this would be the last date in which she received benefits. Here's another pension payment card for a different soldier, and it has a line for disability. That's GSWL, gunshot wound left shoulder. So that's why he qualified for a pension. So again, very handy information. Again, the pension cards varied over time, and not all of them have the disability listed there, but some of them do. And then we get to the numerical index. This causes a lot of confusion. I get this question a lot from people online saying, I found this on Fold 3 because it's the only place you can get it. and my ancestor is Albert Asbell, for instance, who are all these other people? How are they connected? How are they related to my guy? Well, the answer is they're not. There's no connection between them at all, except they all share that number, 501030, in one context or another. Now, you remember there's application numbers, there's certificate numbers for the veteran, there's application numbers and certificate numbers for the widow, and another set for each child, for the father, the mother, and the sister. So all of these 4 people have that number somewhere on their pension record, on their pension index card. Now, what possible use is this? Well, it was created in order, the pension office would receive correspondence from people saying, my husband died and I want his pension, and his pension number was 501030. Well, was it the application number or was it the certificate number? Or in other cases, was it the veteran's number or the widow's number, as that correspondence would come in? So the pension office could pull that number and see all the different people who had that number somewhere in their on their pension file. So this is broken down several different ways. You see the top half says invalid on the far left and dependent down at the bottom. And then there are columns says original. You remember original is a synonym for application, and STF or CTF, which is certificate. So for Albert Asbell, 501030 is his application number, and 749788 is his certificate number. For Benjamin Shireman, it doesn't list his certificate number separately because on the left-hand side it says 501030 is Benjamin Shireman's certificate number. And his application number is not on this card. Then there's a guy named Ban, which we'll get back to in a second, and then David Klein. So David Klein is the veteran, but we're talking about a dependent. So this application was filed by a dependent of David Klein. We don't know who that is right now from this card alone, but we do know that it was the widow of David Klein, because you see the W right above CTF. So the applicant whose dependent application number is 501030, and certificate number, whose certificate number is 501030, and whose application number we don't know right now, was the widow of David Klein. Now let's go back and look at Ban here for a second. In a lot of these pension or numerical index cards, the soldier is listed only by the first three letters of his last name. I don't know why. They just got lazy or something, but it's pretty common. And so all we know about him right now is that his last name starts with BAN. His application number is 501030. He's a dependent of the applicant is a dependent of this soldier, and his certificate number is 350844. Now, because we know his certificate number, there's another card with that number on it. There's a card with every number on it. And so if we look at 350844 in the top left corner, we can see that a dependent with that certificate number was a dependent of Henry Bannister. That's Ban. So sometimes it takes more than one card to piece this together. Just to go back and refresh your memory, this is 51030 was Ban's application number, 350844 is certificate number, and this is his general index card, and that's where those numbers come from. So again, you can pull one index card and get a very small part of the story, or you can pull as many as you can get access to and piece together a lot more information. This, by the way, the dependent we've been talking about, dependent of Henry Bannister, is Rhoda L. This is the first time we see her name on all these cards, but that's on the general index card. some other examples. We saw this card earlier, but I also wanted to point out that this is a soldier with an alias. So his name was Elvin D. Bradley, but he went by John Kelly at some point in his military service. And why would they do that? Well, sometimes they were running from the law and they would register under one name and in order not to be found. Sometimes they'd be running from their widow or their wife. Sometimes they'd be running from their parents because they enlisted underage and they didn't want their parents to come and get them. Over the years, by the time it came for him wanting compensation for his service in the form of a pension, you see this happened in 1891. Well, by then, he'd assumed his name again, and he fessed up to the fact that he had registered under a different name. If he hadn't done that, he probably would not have qualified because they couldn't find any service record for him. So it's not uncommon to find aliases, and there'll be another card for the same soldier under John Kelly, if that's the name you happen to know, and it will say Elvin Bradley was his name, but John Kelly was an alias. This is another organizational index card that has his rank. He was a primary musician, was his last rank in service. This again is not on the general index card. And it also has his different regiments that he served under. Looks like BNF 20th Maine and 7th Maine Infantry. Both types of cards would have his other regiments usually, and they would usually agree. But sometimes one will have an enlistment in a regiment that the other one doesn't mention. And here's an example where it lists not only his death date, but also his death place. Here's another general index card, and you know that, by the way, because the names at the top are there. The general index, remember, the one on Ancestry and Family Search is the one with the dependent names right under the soldiers' names. The organizational index does not have that. And so here, the widow is Susan. She applied in 1897 and did not receive a pension. She was living in West Virginia at the time she applied. And then the line below that says C-U-N-T-E-S-T, contested widow. That's what that means. So this is another woman, Margaret, who said, no, he wasn't your husband, he was my husband. And he might have been both. But Margaret applied in 1900, so 3 years after Susan did. And Margaret got the pension, Susan did not. So again, we're collecting a lot of information here from the cards. Here's another organizational index card showing another kind of data you'll sometimes see. This is a cross-reference. It says C, S-E-E, IC 724923, Thomas R. Armstrong, Company G, 77th Pennsylvania Infantry. So this is a cross-reference from this pension to another pension, and you'll notice the soldier never applied here. He probably died in service, or not, but the widow is the first one who applied in 1879, and this cross-reference at the bottom is usually a reference to her other husband, her subsequent husband. So she applied in 1879 and received the pension, but and we don't know for sure unless we looked up Thomas Armstrong, but probably when she married him, her eligibility under James Cave expired, and she started to draw pension from Thomas. So there'll be a separate pension file for him, and all of his documentation, she'll be mentioned in detail in both of those files. If you're after the widow, more so than the veteran himself, you'd want to at least pull both files. So this is all kinds of information you might find on pension index cards themselves. Soldier's name, enlistment dates, rank, his company and regiment, other regiments he served in, where he lived at the time he applied, the nature of his disability, when and where he died, his widow's information, their marriage, her other husbands, her death date, minor children and their birth dates, their place of residence, and where the pension file can be found, whether it's likely to be in DC or St. Louis or with the Veterans Administration. All of this information, though, the point is on the cards. You can get this information sitting in your jammies with your laptop at home. You don't have to go to DC to get it, in a lot of cases. Now, every pension is different. Index cards are all different. Some will have this information and some will not. Different combinations of these data types on these records, but an awful lot of information usually can be compiled from looking at one or multiple index cards. So where can you find the pension file? Once you get those numbers together, the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 pensions are online on Fold 3. War of 1812 pensions are only done up through the letter S right now. They're still digitizing them. Surname starting with S. So anything prior to that will be online. Anything after that you can get in DC. Union Army pension files are mostly in the National Archives in DC. Some of them are on Fold 3, a pretty small percentage of them. Any widow's pension with a certificate number of 148,100 or less is online on Fold 3. If you were to go to the National Archives and ask for such a pension, they wouldn't give it to you. They would say it's online, go get it there. So it's worth checking that before you go down there. Now, of course, the National Archives has computers there, just as you do in the library here, and you can go and sit down and get it off of their computer, but why go down there at all if it's online? The National Archives website has a very few pension records online. These would be pensions that citizens went to and used what they call the Innovation Hub, which is a series of scanners that you can use if you were to go down there. If you didn't have your own scanner or camera, you can use their equipment, go home with a thumb drive with a pension on it, and then they will take that and also put it online. Yes, sir.
Oh, on Revolutionary War and War of 1812, what is the S for?
Surname starting with S is as far as the War of 1812 has been done. All of the Revolutionary War pensions are online, and all of the War of 1812 up through the soldier's last name starting with S, alphabetically. So they started with A, and they scanned them all, and they're working on S. Eventually they'll have them all, but as of right now, only those through the letter S are done.
So the only way to get that is online, Fold 3, and that you have to pay for that.
Well, no, remember you can get them in many libraries or in the Family History Center at the LDS Center up in, what did we say it was? Hempstead, or any other one in the country. They also have, Fold 3 often has free weekends. They just had one, in fact, for Veterans Day. Veterans Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July weekend, they usually have free weekends where they just invite you to come in without a subscription. And for 2 days, you just pig out and get as much off the website as you can without paying anything. So there are,
Library here have it?
this library has Ancestry, but it doesn't have Fold 3.
Okay.
The handout down towards the bottom under blog posts says free access to ancestry.com and Fold 3. That link, if you follow that link, that's one of my blog posts, and it outlines all the places where you can get the access to Ancestry and Fold 3, and including a map where you can find all the family history centers. The Union Army, again, we talked about CNXC numbers. Some of those are in St. Louis, and some are held by the Veterans Administration. Union Army and Navy records, pension records, are all on Fold 3. They're all done, and about half of them are on NARA, the National Archives website. Fold 3 and Ancestry 2 went into an agreement with National Archives. I don't know if you are familiar with the details of this, but basically the National Archives said, fine, you can scan our records and you can have them exclusively for some number of years, but that period of time expires, and at that point you have to give them all back to us if we put them on our website. And so it's true that many of these records are only available on paid websites, although there are ways to get them access for free. But And so a lot of people are put off by that. These are public records, but I have to pay to get them, is what the argument I often hear. But the alternative is they never would have been scanned at all, and they would never make it to the National Archives website, because the National Archives doesn't have the resources to do that. So it was a blessing that Fold 3 and Ancestry got access to those and were able to scan them, even though they won't all be available on the National Archives website for some years still. Remember, Confederate Army and Navy pension files are all managed by the states. On the handout again, there's the fourth blog post bullet point there has a blog post about Confederate pension records, and they are broken down on the website by state, so you can find the state you want, and it'll tell you where to find those pension records. Most of them are online. Sir?
Do you know whether the Veterans Administration is still sending the C and XC files off to?
They haven't sent any for, I think the last bunch they sent was in the 70s, maybe, something like that.
Okay.
Why is a good question.
Yeah.
But I know that part of the reason is that if you ask for a pension that's still at the Veterans Administration, as I have, very often they say we can't find it. It's sitting on somebody's desk somewhere, or it's in a closet somewhere, and we don't know where they are. So they're clearly not very organized, and if Congress passed a law saying you have to give them all back to the archives, I don't know if they could even do it. It'd certainly be a major effort to do it. But they should, because right now we can't get them at all in many of those cases. And if I had my druthers, the ones that are in St. Louis would be sent to DC as well. There's no reason for them to be split up that way.
Well, I think St. Louis is sending them to NARA in DC.
They've only sent 2,700 so far,
Yeah, okay.
out of many, many thousands.
But it's something to do with how old they are?
No, I don't think so. I mean, how old they are did affect whether the Veterans Administration gave them up. But once they're at the National Archives in St. Louis, they should have sent them all back to DC, but they've only sent 2,700. Now my main blog post about Civil War pensions is the third one on the handout there. It says Secrets of Civil War Pensions. It's actually a 7-part series. And one of the things in that series under eligibility is a lookup tool. So you can enter in that C or XC number, and it will tell you whether it's in DC or in St. Louis Veterans Administration. All of the pensions from the early Indian Wars, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, or collectively they called it the Old War, those are in DC. They've not been digitized. How do you get a pension file once you know where it is? Well, you can drive down there, of course. You can drive to the National Archives, then you deal with traffic and you deal with parking and the expense involved. Probably for you here in Carroll County, the easiest way is to go to the MARC train in either West Baltimore or Baleford. Take that down to Union Station. There's a red line station there at Union Station. Take Gallery Place, transfer to the Green Line. The National Archives has a metro stop. It's called Archives. And this is the National Archives building. That little indescript door